I think it's accurate to say that Final Fantasy XII feels very different from any of the main series entries that came before it. It was during the course of this game's development that Square became plagued with a great deal of internal strife, which resulted in a complete overhaul of its management structure. Despite these troubles though, Final Fantasy XII proved itself to be an experience that resonated with millions of players, and departed in many ways from the trends that players had used to define what makes a Final Fantasy game. While it has some structural issues, I can't help but enjoy most of what it has to offer, and consider it to be among the better RPGs I've played since its release in 2006. The turn of the century proved to be a fateful time for Squaresoft, one that would launch a dramatic altering of the company's future course and greatly influence the subsequent development of the mainline Final Fantasy series. It was in the year 2000 that disagreements surged in Square's upper management, involving, among other things like the over-reliance on the Final Fantasy brand name, the particular implementation of a potential merger with rival company Enix. At this time, Final Fantasy series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was the executive vice president of Squaresoft and president of its North American division, while also remaining the executive producer for the company's flagship series. It was he, along with company president Hisashi Suzuki, who opposed specific business strategies submitted by newly appointed CFO Yoichi Wada. However, it was in the year 2000 that Square ended up recording a significant financial deficit where they had estimated a surplus, something that was directly due to the delay of Final Fantasy X, a game for which Sakaguchi was serving as executive producer. With Final Fantasy XI already deep into production and Final Fantasy XII beginning its development cycle, this delay for 10 came at exactly the wrong time for the financial reports, putting Square in red ink for the first time since the company had been opened to the stock market. It was Sakaguchi primarily who took responsibility for this, and resigned from upper management as a result, returning exclusively to a creative management position. As the company moved into 2001, Final Fantasy XII was announced to be in production in late January. This means that sometime within the previous year, the staff for 12 had been selected and put into place, which would have fallen into Sakaguchi's jurisdiction. With his protege Yoshinori Kitase working hard to finish Final Fantasy X, and Hiromichi Tanaka, a leading Final Fantasy developer and creator of the Mana series, busy managing the development of Final Fantasy XI, Sakaguchi decided to hand the reins for Final Fantasy XII's development to Yasumi Matsuno, director of both Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. Alongside him, once again, was placed Hiroyuki Ito to manage everything to do with battle mechanics. However, just 4 months later in May, Sakaguchi registered a domain name for Mistwalker, alongside a registration to the United States Patent Office. This was most likely done in anticipation of the fact that Square's first feature film, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, a project Sakaguchi had directed and President Hisashi Suzuki had supported, was projected internally to be a failure. Whether they knew to what extent it would fail is unclear, but the reality is that it became one of the biggest box office bombs in the history of Hollywood, and significantly damaged Square's financial standing. This monumental loss, along with the financial reports earlier in the year, caused Enix to back away from talks concerning the merger, and quickly led to an opportunistic Yoichi Wada stepping forward and requesting the trust of board members, believing he could rescue Square from these financial woes. In the end, they gave him that trust. Sakaguchi and Suzuki's ideas were dismissed, and luckily for Mr. Wada, Final Fantasy X, XI, and Kingdom Hearts went on to be enormously successful, putting Square back on track within 2 years. Enix then returned and successfully negotiated the merger, Sakaguchi and Suzuki left Square, and a ton of employees faithful to the creator of Final Fantasy, many of whom were working on FF12, left with him to establish his own independent game studio, Mistwalker. Many people mistakenly believe that Sakaguchi was forced out of Square because of the failure of Spirits Within, but the truth is that he had had disagreements with upper management well before the release of the movie, most notably in relation to the Final Fantasy series and how the company should develop it. He's always disliked the idea of sequels, which is why every Final Fantasy before that time had featured a new world with new characters. However, there were many within upper management who wanted to begin exploiting the series, their words, not mine, by using existing assets to create direct sequels at a low cost for maximum profits. These disagreements likely came to a boiling point with the financial reports and the box office bomb of Spirits Within, But in actuality, Sakaguchi stayed with the company for 2 years after that, leaving on his own accord to start Mistwalker well after Final Fantasy XII was in development. With all of that being said, I can only imagine how much pressure Yasumi Matsuno felt among this debacle and restructuring process. When Sakaguchi was an executive, he went through great lengths to support the creators under him, giving them as much freedom as he possibly could to achieve their own personal vision for the games they were creating. This new management, however, liked to involve itself a little bit more in that creative process. In an interview with IGN, character designer Akihiko Yoshida spoke about how the hero character of the story was originally supposed to be rugged, big, and tough. In truth, Bosch was meant to be the main protagonist of the game, though not exactly in the same form that he appears in the final version. Executives, however, grew concerned about the marketability of an older main character. They pointed at Matsuno's own Vagrant story as an example of a game featuring such a character that didn't have the selling power Square was hoping for. Because of this, they mandated that a younger main character be placed in the game in hopes to create that marketability among their target audience. With a revision like this being requested several years into the development process, when the story had certainly already been near completion, just imagine how frustrating that would have been for Matsuno as the director. In truth, it proved too much for him, and citing health issues as a concern, Square announced that he would be resigning as the director of the game while it was still in development, stepping into a supervisor role for the remainder of its production. He ended up leaving Square entirely shortly after. Sakaguchi later revealed his own thoughts on Final Fantasy XII in an interview with EGM, stating that he had only been able to bring himself to play the very beginning. You really can't expect much from a game when Yasumi Matsuno, a crucial member of the team, leaves in the middle of development. Now, don't mistake the purpose of this. I'm not bringing up all this dirt on Final Fantasy XII because I'm trying to bag on it. To the contrary, I find it remarkable how good the game is despite all of this drama that went on behind the scenes. It's by no means a perfect game, and the reasons for this are numerous, but given the rough development history, I find a lot of that to be completely understandable. That doesn't make its missteps any less disappointing, but all in all, I'd say that even considering its imperfections, Final Fantasy XII is among my favorites in the series, perhaps even cracking the top 5 for me. I credit this largely to the fact that the staff who stepped up and took over in Matsuno's place were extremely talented and competent developers. I don't think any of them are as good at telling a story as Matsuno is, and it definitely shows, but otherwise they really came through in a big way to create an overall solid experience. For starters, Hiroyuki Ito replaced Matsuno as one of the game's co-directors, and there isn't a single developer in that company, maybe aside from Yoshinori Kitase, with a pedigree like his. He was a co-director with Kitase on Final Fantasy VI and the sole director on Final Fantasy IX, two of the most well-respected games in the series. The second director to assume Matsuno's prior role was Hiroshi Minigawa, previously the graphics and real-time visual director, but also a developer who had been working with Matsuno since their time at Quest when they had made Tactics Ogre. He had also worked with him on Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story, and was probably the one staff member on the team who most closely understood his mind and intentions. As had been the case on many previous projects, Ito was placed in charge of systems and battle mechanics, while the art and story was left to others, and in this case, in the hands of Minigawa. It's there that I'd like to start, with the story. But before doing so, I want to come back to Sakaguchi's statement about FF12 and add a little bit more to it. I don't share his cynical view of the game overall, and I'll repeat, I don't think Final Fantasy XII is bad, like, at all. But I do think it's clear that the game, and more particularly the story, lost something with the absence of the original director's influence. After experiencing Matsuno's previous work, it's made immediately apparent that he's a genius storyteller. When I say that, I don't just mean he has good ideas for plots and characters. What I mean is that the way in which he tells his stories, the techniques employed within every aspect from the writing and pacing to the choices made with the cinematography, music, art, and overall presentation are just profoundly adept. The same is true of Final Fantasy XII at the outset, where it begins with bold and gripping choices on all fronts. But somewhere around the midway point, it begins to meander a little and loses its sense of urgency and direction. Let me clarify that I think the plot itself is good, and many of the ideas are fascinating, but it's the techniques, those special touches of Matsuno's that make every scene feel so dynamic, that were clearly lost when he stepped away from the project. While those who filled his shoes had worked closely with him before, it's clear, at least to me, that they did not share his talent when it comes to structuring an engaging story. I think the way Bosch is utilized, or should I say not utilized, was particularly puzzling to me, especially within scenes that should in every conceivable way concern him more than any other character. There are other instances where enormous twists are revealed, and then absolutely nothing is done with those ideas after the initial bomb drop. There are also characters who to many players feel like they're just along for the ride without any clear purpose or motivation for being there. When you pull back and really dig at why the story was unsatisfactory to a fair amount of the audience though, I think what it comes down to is simply structure and pacing. I think the world of Ivalice itself, the same world that served as a setting for Matsuno's previous games, is very well realized and has some incredibly interesting lore. I think the plot, when broken down to a more basic level, has some amazing potential, and the writing when it comes to dialogue is top-notch, even better than the other main series entries in my opinion. The performances from the actors and the animation are all solid as well, not to mention how gorgeous the game was. The only issue here is just the way that story is given to the player, the amount of information given, in what way, and at which points throughout the experience. There are so many moments that left me in silence just thinking, man, that was a really great scene. But it's hard to ignore the imbalance between gameplay and plot that shows its face in the closing acts. I find it telling that despite the fact that my first playthrough was nearly 70 hours long, I felt like the story was short. The truth is that the vast majority of those 70 hours were spent trudging through extremely long dungeons and field maps, fighting hundreds and hundreds of battles, and the story very much took a back seat. When watching some of the interviews on the bonus disc for the collector's edition, I found it interesting that Hiroshi Minigawa mentioned how many great ideas he was forced to cut. He mentioned specifically that there were some great ideas that came from the writers that he regretted having to omit in order to meet deadlines. I can say for my part that the end of the game does feel like it's missing something when it comes to the delivery of the story and the resolution of many character arcs. However, I have to say that the dialogue in particular is just fantastic in this game. I personally find that the speech sits in this exact right balance between feeling elevated and appropriately antiquated, but without devolving into purple prose. I find much of the language in Final Fantasy XII to be powerful and compelling, giving this layer of polish that makes it feel really good to read and listen to. Much of this was due to how the game was localized for English-speaking countries. The translation was done by just two men, Alexander O. Smith and Joseph Reeder, who actually decided themselves to work as a two-man team in order to keep the script feeling as consistent as possible, even if it cost them more sleepless nights in the process trying to hit their deadlines. As you listen to interviews with these guys, it's clear how passionate they were about maintaining a sense of realism and scope that matched the rich world the game was based in. I think their work here is phenomenal and might be the most impressive aspect of the entire game for me. Another thing I love about FF12 is how strong the voice acting is. When we take the series as a whole, I think it's featured a lot of poor voice performances. Not because the actors themselves are bad, but because I think the voice directors have struggled to find a balance between replicating the Japanese voice work with tone, inflection, and speed, while also attempting to make the lines sound as natural as possible to English speakers. For the most part, I'd say the series has not done this well. I mean, for Final Fantasy XIII, they went as far as to train Georgia Van Cuylenburg, Vanille's voice actress, to perfectly recreate even minor sounds made by the Japanese actress. However, the complete opposite is true here with Final Fantasy XII. Just as the translators were willing to alter the text in order to make it flow naturally in English without changing the underlying meaning, the voice cast was given a ton of freedom to find and interpret their characters in their own way, irrespective of the Japanese performances. The localization team chose not to search among traditional voice actors, but rather to find their cast mostly among stage and film actors in an attempt to bring more physicality to the performances. In my opinion, this approach yielded pretty good results, which gave us the best voice acting for the entire series thus far, and went a long way toward building a solid cast of believable characters. That being said, it's probably time we address the elephant in the room, Vaughn and Penelo. I am honestly baffled by the amount of hate these characters receive online. If you've ever taken a look at the poll results conducted by the JRPG subreddit that asked community members to rate characters across a ton of different JRPGs, you'll find that Vaughn and Penelo sit at second and fourth to last, respectively. They rank lower than Choo-Choo from Xenogears, for crying out loud. I'd heard a lot of complaints about these characters before playing FF12 for myself, and expected Vaughn in particular to be extremely obnoxious or something. But after completing the game, I can tell you that he's really not that bad of a character. There's only one scene in the game where I thought he was acting irrationally or out of line. Aside from that, he's just a good kid trying to help out. I totally agree with the criticism that he doesn't have the strongest reason to stay with the group for the entirety of the game, because the plot revolves more around Ash, and therefore he doesn't merit being pushed as the game's leading protagonist. But despite this, he and Penelo, who has even less business participating in the events of the story, do not deserve the vitriol that they receive. I like most of the scenes they appear in, and I think the developers were able to establish a believable bond between them that would definitely lead to their desire to remain unseparated. As for the rest of the cast, I like them a lot. I love Bosch's undying discipline and loyalty, Ash's conflicted journey and internal struggles, Balthier's irresistible wit and charm, Fran's, poise and aura of wisdom, all of which is rounded out by a strong group of temporary non-playable characters that join the party throughout the game. However, there's no question that Final Fantasy XII could have used much stronger character development. It's undoubtedly lacking in that area, again mostly because the second half of the game is underutilized with its storytelling potential. But despite this, I like the characters. I think they're a charismatic group who are easy to get behind. It's just a shame that we get such a strong start in introducing interesting arcs when most of them don't go anywhere by the time the story concludes. I've got to say though, I'm a big fan of the world Square created for this game. While Ivalice itself has served as the setting for Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant's story, this take on the world was certainly unlike anything we'd seen before. The story of Final Fantasy XII actually takes place in a time long before both games previously mentioned. And while they were obviously inspired by Western European and particularly British medieval history, this game's art design actually took large inspiration from cultures found in the Mediterranean. This was a really fresh take for the series, and I really dig all of it. There are some players I've talked to who didn't like that a fairly substantial portion of the game, mostly in the beginning, takes place in a large desert area, but once you get going, there really are some incredibly diverse and absolutely gorgeous landscapes. It's the character design that I think I appreciate the most when it comes to the visuals, though. Akihiko Yoshida is definitely my favorite character designer for the series, with his work on FF12 and FF14 being his best in my opinion. I know that may come with some controversy, but this isn't a criticism of Yoshitaka Amano or Tetsuya Nomura, who are both fantastic artists. Rather, it's just personal praise of Yoshida's style. If nothing else, it's perfect in this instance for the more grounded setting of Final Fantasy XII, and when executed in final form, it became what is widely considered to be the best-looking game on the PS2. Literally, the only complaint I have with it is Vaughn's muscle textures, and especially his abs. Like, what on earth were they thinking with this? They got Bosch's torso right. Why did they do this to Vaughn? Those look like tattoos, not muscles. Luckily, they addressed it in the Zodiac Age, and it looks better now, but even still, when we compare it to Bosch, like, what is going on here? Another large source of controversy surrounding this game, especially at the time it was released, was how it differed from the previous offline entries when it came to battle mechanics. Even in interviews with Hiroyuki Ito, he seemed to feel like it was a little rough and could have used some streamlining. He even hoped he'd get a chance to continue refining it in later installments in the series. Let me start right off the bat by saying that the ADB system, or Active Dimensional Battle System, really isn't all that different functionally from the ATB system of earlier Final Fantasy games. Setting aside the aesthetic differences, mostly the fact that you can run around freely during battles, what we have here is a menu-based command system with an ATB bar that builds up after every action, exactly as we'd seen before. There are automated elements built into it, which I'll get into in just a second, but overall it's very similar to what had been done previously. You can also play on active or wait time, which will either force the player to select their commands in real time, or pause the game to give the player as much time as he or she wishes to make plans and execute strategies. I also love that they completely did away with random encounters here. The battles themselves also move really quickly, so the time spent in between running on the map, being interrupted by a random encounter, waiting for a long screen transition, fighting the battle, watching the characters celebrate, seeing the results on the battle screen, then finally getting back to exploring again is cut significantly here. And it's cut even more so in both the International and Zodiac versions due to the fast forward feature. The most important thing for me though is that engaging an enemy, defeating it, and moving on is a totally seamless experience. There will be those who will argue that even though FF12 goes to great lengths to make battling quicker and smoother, it also adds so many enemies in the area zones, many of which contain extremely large field maps that take hours to get through, that it negates any progress they might have made in shortening the time spent fighting individual battles. The people who make that argument aren't wrong. There are definitely a number of spots where I felt very fatigued because the zones and dungeons were just agonizingly long. I became frustrated in particular by the journey from Rabanastre to Arcades, as well as the Pharos Tower, but I'd say for the majority of the game I didn't feel that frustration myself, and really enjoyed battling for the most part. One reason people might have felt like the battles weren't as exciting in this installment is likely due to the battle animations themselves. In previous games, the animations in battle were really snappy and dramatic, with characters taking wide power stances and leaping across the screen in such a way as to communicate that there was a lot of strength and weight behind the attacks. In Final Fantasy XII, though, characters don't move in the same exaggerated way, giving them a bit of a nonchalant feel as they fight. I could see this leading to some players feeling like the battles are boring, despite the fact that they mostly work the same way as previous Final Fantasy games. Also, because of the seamless nature between the game's exploration and combat, there isn't a battle track that plays every time a new battle is initiated. Rather, the area music just continues playing even when you fight, whether that's a peaceful melody or a bombastic one. There's definitely some great boss battle music, don't get me wrong, but there isn't a standard battle theme like players were used to seeing in other installments. I think both of these things, on top of the sheer number of fights you'll engage in with the size of the maps, leads people to the conclusion that FF12 feels like playing an MMO rather than a single-player RPG.
I also think where a lot of people get tripped up is with the Gambit system. You can think of Gambits like very simple if-then lines of code that dictate how party members who are not being controlled by the player will behave during battles. There are two parts to a Gambit. The if statement, something like if a party member's HP falls below 50%, followed by the then statement, something like then the character will use a potion. This is probably the most rudimentary example there is, and as you might imagine, the Gambit system goes a lot deeper than that, giving the player unprecedented control of how his or her party members will be automated. Most of these Gambit commands will not be available right from the start though, with the vast majority needing to be purchased in Gambit shops or found in chests throughout the world. Each party member will also start out with only 2 Gambit slots, but can unlock up to 12 over the course of the game. The order in which they're placed from top to bottom will determine their priority, with Gambits at the top receiving highest precedence, while Gambits at the bottom receive the lowest. So for example, if a player places Attack Nearest Enemy as the top Gambit with a Cure spell underneath that, the AI-controlled character will always prioritize attacking the nearest enemy and will never cast the healing spell while there are enemies around to engage. So, it would be wiser to place the healing spell on top of it so that when a party member falls below a certain percentage of his or her maximum HP, the character will heal, then go back to attacking until someone else's HP falls below 50%. You can also interrupt your Gambit set at any time during the battle by giving your characters an impromptu manual command, which will always override your Gambit hierarchy. In addition to this, you can change your Gambits on the fly, even in the middle of combat, to make sure your characters are acting in the most appropriate way in any given circumstance. This includes being able to swap characters in and out of the active party at will, something I loved about Final Fantasy X as well. Now, it's important to bring up here that while this level of automation is possible, it isn't necessarily required. You don't have to set up Gambits for your characters if you don't want to. If you'd rather, you can give each character their commands manually. However, doing so would really break up the flow of combat in such a way as to make it feel extremely tedious in my opinion. And there's no doubt that the game was balanced with the Gambit system in mind. It was intended to be played with them on, but what I'm getting at is that the player can control how much or how little automation there is. I personally ran with Gambits that gave me a lot of room to give manual commands for the majority of my playthrough. But I also like to play on wait time, which allows me to settle in and think through what my next move is going to be. If you want to play the game on active time and give your party members strictly manual commands, you'll either have to be lightning fast with your menu selection, or you'll probably just die a lot. I will admit though, even when playing on wait time, I found myself in later dungeons having trouble dealing with certain status effects quickly enough to be truly efficient with manual commands. And as soon as I set up gambits to deal with those status effects, all my problems melted away. When you have gambits set up, the characters act so immediately as to make using them a lot more efficient overall. There are many players I've talked to who just don't like this at all. They'd rather have complete manual control over their characters at all times, especially during tougher boss fights. And I admit that the game definitely pushes the player toward using gambits. I personally really enjoyed the system though, and found just as much satisfaction from the strategy to be found in Gambit setup as I did from customizing my party and executing those commands myself in previous Final Fantasy titles. I liked experimenting with the system and thinking through how to establish the most effective chains, and I also loved that this could be modified right in the middle of battle to make adjustments when needed. I thought it was a lot of fun, but there are a lot of people who don't. So whether or not it's going to be something you enjoy will depend on how much manual control you like to have in your RPGs. Character progression is handled with the license board, a system similar in a lot of ways to Final Fantasy X's Sphere Grid, but with an even greater level of openness and control. If you're playing the original PS2 release, that is. There are actually 3 different versions of Final Fantasy XII, and the largest difference between them is how character growth and game balance are handled. All 3 function on the same basic idea, where the player gathers ability points, called license points in this installment, after battling, and expends those points to unlock the capability to use abilities and equipment. You still have to buy spells, techniques, weapons, and armor from shops, but until you unlock the proper license, you can't use them. Apparently, the idea for the license board was inspired by the game world, in the sense that your characters are supposed to acquire licenses in order to carry certain weapons and whatnot. But in practice, it doesn't work like that, which sort of made me curious as to why they bothered with the license motif at all. But when it comes to utility, it works great. Basically, each time you unlock a new node, all the available adjacent nodes reveal themselves, allowing the player to branch out in whichever direction he or she pleases. In the original game, the player was required to explore the board in search of abilities and equipment, which couldn't be seen until an adjacent node was unlocked. But in the Zodiac Age, the player is able to see right from the beginning all of the abilities contained on the board, which gives a lot more room for planning ahead. I actually really enjoy the license board from a mechanical standpoint. It felt kind of addictive in a way, and I often found myself saying things like, okay, I'll just unlock one more ability and then call it for today. But as soon as I unlocked that ability, I saw the new ones that opened up, realized how cool it would be to have those, and wanted to continue playing until I got them. For me, it was a fairly involved process, which made it super enjoyable. While the original release gave the player access to an open license board right from the beginning of the game, the international version, which was only released in Japan a little over a year after the original, locked each character into one of 12 available jobs, and the Zodiac Age, the newest HD remaster of the game on PS4, allows each character to select 2 of those 12 jobs. Abilities and equipment are now tied to specific classes rather than being open for every character to unlock and use like before. As you can imagine, these differences actually change how the game is played fairly significantly, and from the developer side required some changes to game balance. The original game's super open approach left room, I think, to design some pretty challenging boss fights, seeing as if the player runs into trouble, the useful abilities and equipment for the fight can be gained by any, if not all of the characters with a little grinding. I actually thought the balance of the original game was pretty spot on, with several bosses that caused me to rethink my strategy and switch up my gambits mid-fight. The international version was similarly challenging, with the added restriction of the class system requiring the player to use characters within specific roles. The Zodiac Age, however, is very, very easy in comparison. This is due to the developers purposefully reducing the game's difficulty, but also because of the addition of the second job for the characters. In the international version, since characters could only hold one job, they were forced to live with the weaknesses that came with it. But in the Zodiac Age, a player could take a black mage, for instance, and make up for its inherent weaknesses by pairing it with the monk class. This essentially erases the entire point of a class system to begin with, which is to have the player form a party where certain characters' weaknesses are complemented by another character's strengths. It establishes the need for team-based fighting, which was what the original game lacked because every character could fill every role. If anything, the Zodiac Age needed a rebalance of its difficulty to make it more difficult because of the addition of the second job. But unfortunately, they went the other way around and now it's laughably easy. I find this extremely unfortunate because there are a lot of other additions that make the Zodiac Age very appealing in my opinion. I have to say that when it comes to world construction and RPGs, I enjoy zones far more than seamless open worlds. While games like Final Fantasy XV have much larger maps when it comes to technical size, Final Fantasy XII's world feels so much larger because when you leave a zone, it's often implied and even shown with matte paintings in the background that the party traveled very far in between. This zone structure, on top of the size of the field maps, makes Final Fantasy XII's world feel absolutely massive, which gives the sense of this epic, long journey. I find it to be an improvement over Final Fantasy X's linear maps, but also preferable to, say, Final Fantasy XV's open world structure, that ended up feeling small in the grand scale of things. Similarly to 10 though, you can't take full control of an airship flying over the world map, which was always one of my favorite feelings playing the older games. You can still ride airships, but you can't control them yourself. And there's almost no need to board them anyway, except to buy a few exclusive items and abilities, seeing as the game contains a teleport fast travel system. These are small nitpicks to be sure, but worth mentioning nonetheless. In terms of side content, Final Fantasy XII has a lot to offer. I think the most widely appreciated side quests are the hunts. Basically, as you progress through the game, hunts will be posted on boards throughout the world that the player can take on for added challenges. This is all tied back to a guild in Rabanastre, which has ranks that the player can ascend as you complete more of these hunts, and in the process unlocks access to a certain shop with really good equipment and accessories. I enjoyed many of these hunts, several of which contain the most well-designed fights in the game and have extended many players' total playtime well beyond 200 hours. There are also dozens of additional side quests on top of the hunts, rounding out the game's total number of features quite nicely. Since the very beginning of the series, there's one area in which Final Fantasy has always excelled. Even as the developers experimented with new gameplay ideas, wildly different narratives, and gigantic visual design shifts, the music has consistently been brilliant. Nobuo Uematsu has become world-renowned for his work, with arrangements of his music being performed by orchestras touring the globe. His genius with melody has helped instill a familiarity and intimacy with these worlds and characters that is nearly unparalleled. Unfortunately, as with many other changes that occurred within Square after the merger with Enix, Uematsu decided to leave the company after the headquarters were relocated. In an interview with RPG Fan, he was quoted as saying, "I thought I had reached an age where I should gradually take the control over my life into my own hands." There's no question that the loss of a composer like Uematsu was a major blow for the company. His music was a vital part of what the identity and soul of the brand had become. In so many ways, his soundtracks helped define Final Fantasy for the fans. Considering that legacy, and with the standard of quality that was set by Mr. Uematsu over the years, it's understandable to me how divisive the first soundtrack written without his influence would be. The only pieces of music he would write for Final Fantasy XII would be Kiss Me Goodbye, the theme song played during the credits, as well as a co-written piece for the opening of the game. To replace Uematsu, Matsuno had brought on longtime friend and colleague Hitoshi Sakimoto, who had been working with him since their days at Quest with Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre. He had also composed Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story for Square, and I don't know about you, but I find that to be an incredibly impressive body of work. There are few composers I would have found to be more worthy of being given the reins to a main series entry, but there's no doubt that Sakimoto's style is very different from Uematsu's. While Uematsu's work showed a great diversity in tone and genre, Sakimoto's has a more cinematic quality that resembles the classic Hollywood feel that composers like John Williams helped to pioneer. There are many who will say the Final Fantasy XII soundtrack is not memorable in the way that Uematsu's scores were. They'll tell you when they hear a song from the early Final Fantasy games that images of the characters and locations will immediately spring to mind, something I can confirm to be true for myself. They'll then tell you that this simply isn't the case with FF12, where much of the music is passable but forgettable in their estimation. I have to put it on record that I disagree with this wholeheartedly. While I can clearly hear the difference in style, and while this OST doesn't feel anything like the previous Final Fantasy games, I think the melodies are outstanding and memorable in their own way, and there were plenty of tracks that gave me chills and evoked strong emotion. Again, I understand and agree with the sentiment that they don't feel like classic Final Fantasy, something that I think for many players is true of the entire game. But I do think for the world and story, this music fits magnificently. Not only that though, but I also find myself listening to the soundtrack in my free time. To me, it's just a really strong OST.
And while I know there will be many in the comments who will disagree with that, I've listened to these songs over and over during the last 3 or 4 months and can confidently say that my appreciation for them only continues to grow. Of course, music is a highly subjective topic, and as is the case with Matsuno's style of storytelling, Sakimoto's style of composing just seems to resonate with me. Since this is the case, take my opinion for what it's worth, but I think FF12's soundtrack is terrific. The unfortunate thing about analyzing these Final Fantasy games, especially now that I've entered the more divisive modern era, is that there's a passionately beloved legacy looming over each game that only becomes more untouchable as time goes on. With each passing year, it seems the classics are held in even higher esteem, and newer entries are judged even more harshly. It is true, undoubtedly, that Final Fantasy XII is a very different kind of experience from the classics, both tonally and mechanically, though it does retain enough familiarity to me to justify its status as a main series entry. On top of this, I really do feel that it's a very good game in its own right. It has some problems, certainly, and I definitely felt some frustration during more than a couple of sequences, but the narrative style and writing, as well as the art design, voice direction, and music, all seem to hit the right note for my personal tastes, and to be frank, I enjoyed it tremendously despite its imperfections. I love Yasumi Matsuno as a storyteller, and while it's clear the loss of his influence affected the game in the later stages, I still very much appreciate what he was going for. I also enjoyed the battle mechanics and character progression system, even though I can understand why purists and other players didn't. When all said and done though, I look back on my experience with mostly positive feelings, and I definitely recommend this game to others who, after listening, feel as if they have similar tastes to mine. However, if you don't, and there are plenty of others who don't, there's a pretty good chance that you won't like what it has to offer. As for me, I give Final Fantasy XII 4 Bosch von Ronsenberg of Dalmascas out of 5. Thank you for taking the time to watch my review of Final Fantasy XII. If you're interested in seeing my other Final Fantasy reviews, there's a card here on the left side you can click that'll take you to a playlist for all the ones I've done so far. Also, if you like what you see here and you'd like to help support the channel, please feel free to check out our Patreon page. Thank you for all that you do, and we'll see you again really soon.